Good afternoon. Happy Saturday. My name is Luke. I'm the Education Director for Abundant Housing LA. Really appreciate all of y'all spending a little bit of your Saturday afternoon with us here. And just going to go ahead and dive in. If at any time, just a logistical thing, if any time you have any questions, Esteban Garcia, who works with Abundant Housing LA, is monitoring when people raise their hands. So go ahead and raise your hand. He'll let me know that someone's got a question, and we'll go ahead and take those questions as they come in. I'm used to giving this presentation in person, so this is an interesting experience doing this. Invite each of you, if you have questions along the way, to ask. Really do want to be able to have a back and forth to the degree possible, but also understand that with technology being what is, and that can be a little bit tough sometimes. So bear with us as we go through this, but also thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and okay. So yes, this is Abundant Housing 101. We're going to touch on a lot of material here, but really just touch on. We're not going to dive into a lot of these things. But if you want to ask some questions to dig in a little bit further, I certainly welcome that. I just be clear, I come at this as a volunteer. I don't have a master's or major degree in housing policy. I do have a degree in policy, and I have worked in the local political sphere for a number of years, including several on my neighborhood council. So I have seen a lot of what happens with housing politics and policy, both in the public realm and behind. And really, that's why I'm as interested in as I am, and have put together this presentation for y'all, and hope that you'll get something out of this. So let's see here. Okay. So brief agenda. We're going to just dive in here with the history here around LA's housing, LA's housing history. Then we'll talk a little bit about how that shapes our present, and then give some context around our reason, Abundant Housing LA's theory of change, and our recommended policy ways to focus around our history, really to try and get an understanding of what it is that shapes is today, and how that on a day-to-day basis. And just for a little bit of context about me, this is St. Joseph's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin. I lived here for a couple years as a kid when the hospital was closed. It was an abandoned hospital, but it was the only place that we could live. And I share this not for anyone to feel badly about me, but really just to demonstrate that, even in my own experience as a white man who has a lot of privilege coming to this conversation, this is something that's very personal, having lived a couple of years of my life without, necessarily secure housing, although we did have a roof over our heads. I think each one of us comes to this conversation with any number of different experiences and things that we care about, and reasons that it's important to us. And I just want to acknowledge that that you or I could look at someone else and think we know what it is that their opportunities are based on who they are. And certainly our housing politics, as we'll see in a little bit, has really played out that way. But we all come at this conversation from very different perspectives. So for many of us, this is what housing, trying to find housing in LA is like. It's the Hunger Games of trying to have a roof over your head. And that's, for many of us, why we come to this conversation, because this is our experience. Or for some of us, it's seeing new housing being proposed that basically oftentimes looks like this, and it feels maybe a little disorienting or unrelatable. In this case, this is actually a project that's 100% affordable housing. But a lot of the new housing that gets built often seems like it's sort of all of the same. And for many of us, this is why we come to this conversation, or sort of what sort of we experience when we dive into this is something like this, where we see all these terms and these abbreviations and these references to code and sections and adjustments and actions and all this, and it's confusing. And we'll see in a little bit, these are actually all very intentional things, very intentional policies. What I want to be clear in this, though, is that the conversation today is not going to focus on the what. We're not going to focus on these actions or these specific buildings. What we're going to talk about today is really the why. Why is it that housing is what it is today? How did we get to this point? And what can we do about it? And really the two core ideas at the heart of that are that single family zoning leads to really significant negative externalities in art, which is for the economics term, but negative outcomes for us that I've highlighted a couple things here: significant wealth and opportunity disparities, unaffordable rents for many of us, and homelessness for some of us as well. In the city of LA, 3/4 of our land that is zoned for residential is zoned for single family zoning, but that only holds about 1/3 of our residents. So the bulk of our land is cordoned off for a minority of our population, which also just so happens to be overwhelmingly our white population in LA. And that gets me to the second point, which we're going to see now, really just diving in here in our housing history, that housing and civil rights are inextricably linked. Every step along the way, opportunities to housing have been determined based on race for the past century. Now, today, it's not explicit necessarily in the way it was even just 60 years ago, but it still plays out that way time and time again. So I recognize that coming at this as a white man, that there are certain assumptions that someone could make about me and certain reasons you might not want to hear me talking about this. But I am telling you, as someone who cares about this and really wants specifically and especially white allies to be cognizant of this and to approach this work with the intention of anti-racism, that it's important we understand the background of housing and how that is linked to civil rights throughout our history. So I offer some memes along the way, just to sort of the opportunity to not just be sort of deep in the weeds. But this one actually specifically talks about neighborhood character, which is a term that many of us have heard. And I'm not going to answer what that means right now, but it means something different to each of us. And it's a term that if you've been in housing politics for even just a few months, you've probably heard someone already use. You'll hear it a lot. I would just ask the question, what defines a neighborhood character? Is it the people? Is it the buildings? Is it the businesses? It's kind of an open question, but frankly, it's one that I think if we dived even just a little bit down under the surface to try and understand what people mean when they talk about neighborhood character, we start to see this is a much more complex thing than we might have otherwise assumed it to be. So it's going to be a bit of a doozy, but I'm going to walk you through this, and then we're going to kind of touch on some of these things as we go along through the housing history piece of this. Bear with me. We'll walk through this. You look at this and go, oh my gosh, what am I doing? It's Saturday at 12:10 in the afternoon. Why am I staring at this long timeline? But this is a really, really important piece to understand. And mostly along the bottom of this timeline, you can mostly ignore that. It's mostly just showing the city of LA population growing over time, as well as the proportion of, or the percentage of homeownership of all households in the state of California over time as well. And basically, it's just showing that the city of LA's population has consistently been growing. There were a couple periods in there where our growth was a little more rapid than others, and also to show that the percentage of households in California that were homeowners was consistently in the mid-40s in the early part of the 20th century, and then in the mid-20th century and on, it's consistently been in the mid-50% area, which we'll get into a little later. But there is a significant disparity on the basis of race, which is masked by that number, just showing it as a single number for all households in the state. But the top line is really where I kind of want to focus here on the timeline. And I'll just sort of walk you through what some of these things are. So 1917, 103 years ago, the US Supreme Court, in a decision Buchanan v. Worley, rules that explicit zoning on the basis of race is illegal. And specifically, the law that was contested that went to the Supreme Court was in the state of Kentucky, which the zoning law said that a white person or white household could not purchase a home in a community that was majority black, and vice versa. A black person could not purchase a home in a community that was majority white. And this was a city law that specifically zoned in this fashion, that went all the way up to the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that in a city law. But it's important to recognize that even if the US Supreme Court said this about city laws, a very common tool that was coming into play at that time is what is known as a deed restriction. A deed restriction actually specifically says to a homeowner, to someone who buys it, in most of the homes that were available at this time, we were building a lot of new homes, right? So a lot of people were buying brand new homes. It wasn't the overwhelmingly resale market that we see today. There was a lot more of new construction. And if you bought a new home, you had to agree as that new homeowner that you would abide by a certain set of terms, in terms of like things like paint color you could use in your house, uses you could use with your lawn, but also who you could sell it to. And deed restrictions often, and very often actually, would specifically call out that you could not resell your home to someone who was not white, and sometimes even someone who was not Christian. If they were Hebrew or Muslim, you couldn't sell your home to them either. So deed restrictions were coming into play and becoming very popular at this time. But the Supreme Court didn't speak to that. It spoke to a city law, a city zone, that zoning code that specifically called out white and black communities. So at this time, you couldn't actually zone on the basis of race, but you could have deed restrictions. And the city of LA was one of the very first cities in the country to adopt single-family zones, which were very commonly tied to deed restrictions. Deed restrictions, which, by the way, still exist in many of our communities. So LA was one of the first cities to adopt this popular new kind of zoning of single family, which often, almost always, had deed restrictions tied to it. So moving ahead, just a decade, we're suddenly in the Great Depression. FDR and the Democrats get elected into Congress, and they enact some major reforms in the early 1930s, the National Housing Act being one of them, where the federal government said, we are going to back federal mortgages for the purpose of getting people the opportunity to have access to wealth, because you had the country in significant impoverishment, and home ownership was seen as a big tool for people to be able to get their feet back under them. And specifically, the federal government would back 30-year mortgages, which was a new tool which private banks don't really like to do on their own because it's so risky. How are you supposed to know that someone's going to be able to pay off a loan for the next 30 years? Federal government said, we'll step in. We'll step in order to really jumpstart people's ability to get homes and to invest in them and create wealth through them. So that's what the 1934 National Housing Act put into play. However, part of that, in order to determine levels of risk, was the creation of homeowners loan corporation maps, more popularly known as redlining. We'll dive into this in a little bit. But the redlining maps became the tool to determine where was safe to invest and where was not safe to invest for the federal government, where was safe to back a mortgage and where was not. And that program went into place in 1936, and I've indicated it on the timeline here with a red bar. For the 32 years that redlining was 100% legal, 100% legal for using redlining maps for the purpose of determining where people could receive federally backed mortgages and where they could not. Just a year after redlining came into place, the federal government said, hey, we're realizing that homeownership is still out of reach for a lot of lower income households. So we're going to actually we're going to fund the construction of federal public housing. So that's what we see here in 1937 with a new bill under the whole New Deal era, where the federal government commits to building a lot new public housing. However, that housing is segregated. So initially, most of this housing is going strictly to white households. At some point, a few years later, I want to say it was 1940, 1941, there was some consternation among more progressives in the Congress and the president who realized this, that they weren't serving everyone. So they started creating some public housing for Black and brown households, but they were still segregated, 100% segregated. So in LA, and I have this indicated underneath the timeline, there was an area. The federal government starts funding public housing, and LA sees 6,500 units of federally funded public housing constructed in a single decade. But it stopped in 1950. The reason it stopped is because the voters of California approved Article 34 to the state of California Constitution, which barred the use of public funding for the construction of new housing, except if the voters had approved it by a vote. This is still the law of the land. And actually, Article 34 is up for repeal on our ballots this November, but it has been the law of the land for 70 years that we cannot use public funding to construct new housing. This measure was put on the ballot by the California Association of Realtors in 1950, and it stopped the construction of new public housing in the state of California for decades. Now, there is still public subsidy of new housing that occurs, but there have been a number of additional legal efforts that have had to been undertaken in order to make that happen, and that has increased the cost of building publicly supported, publicly subsidized housing on the scale of something like $5,000 to $20,000 per unit, because of Article 34, which is still the law of the land. But it worked exactly as was intended, because cities knew that no voters were going to say, oh yes, please build more public housing in our community. And that was the intent of the law, and it worked. Going back just one year, in 1949, another housing act, the Federal Housing Act, actually allowed the federal government to do wholesale clearance of communities that they designated as slums, or in a significantly dilapidated condition. And they could go in and just clear cut communities. That's what this measure allowed, and we'll see in a little bit how that impacted us here in Los Angeles pretty significantly. I note here the 1956 Federal Highway Act. Even though we were building highways before that, it wasn't until under President Eisenhower, with the approval of the Federal Highway Act, that we saw massive construction of highways, because that act said every dollar you spend on building a highway, the federal government will chip in $9. And that just was like putting gas on the fire for the construction of federal highways, of highways throughout the country. And in Los Angeles in particular, we had a whole highway plan, a whole program that this just completely just kicked it into high gear, and we saw massive construction of freeways. Most of the freeways we have in LA did not exist 70 years ago. Yet also during this time, we see significant downzoning around Los Angeles, and we'll see how that sort of comes into play. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on the timeline talking about it, but it's worth noting. I also note here in 1964, and I'll talk about it a little later, Prop 14. Just remember the number, just remember the year. You'll see why that's important. The big one in all of this, the end of that red line, is the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which was actually part of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, following up 4 years of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that bill was passed 1 week after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It had languished in Congress for years, subject to filibuster, and with the assassination of MLK Jr. and the country in a whole uproar, Congress finally moved on this bill, which said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in housing. That ended redlining. It ended once and for all the legality of any enforcement of deed restrictions. However, all it said was, okay, it's no longer possible to discriminate on the basis of race. But now, if you look at this timeline, I've just taken you through 50 years of legalized discrimination on the basis of race. So I'm just offering that up to think about the impact of having given several generations the opportunity to build wealth using tools that the federal government was backing in new communities where we were using housing as a wealth building tool that was exclusively available to white households through federal support. I note here the 1970 California Environmental Quality Act. I'll talk a little bit later about why that's on there and why that's important. In 1973, the federal government stopped funding construction of new public housing under the Nixon administration. Just a few years after the Supreme Court said you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race, or not the Supreme Court, excuse me, the 1968 Fair Housing Act said you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race. The federal government said, we're done. We're not building any more public housing. 1978 here in California, we passed Prop 13, which was a significant measure in terms of supporting the people in existing households, keeping their property taxes low, but also subsequently led to additional escalation in property taxes for anyone trying to buy into a new home, because there was pressures on additional pressures on keeping new housing from getting constructed. I've noted in here secession efforts. I'll talk a little bit about what that is in another slide a little later. But I think it's just important to sort of see this in the context of how the timeline plays out. That we see the end of officially allowing legal discrimination on the basis of race, and then we start to see these other things pop up with CEQA and Prop 13 and secession and Prop U, which are all kind of, to me at least, part of continuing to tell this story of understanding how civil rights and housing are inextricably linked, even if we're not necessarily saying black and white in the approaches the policy approaches that were being employed at the time. Proposition U, I won't talk much about in this, but it's a significant one for the city of LA, where we downzoned, the voters approved this measure, downzoning all of our corridors. So we essentially said no more significant buildings on any of our corridors. And I like to call it as the Strip Mall Act of 1986. We saw a massive explosion of strip malls as a result of this, because that was essentially about all you could build on any of our corridors. And Proposition U is still the law of the land. I note here the subprime mortgage debacle in the early 21st century. Those were largely targeted to black and brown households and largely impacted them negatively as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I put on here Measure JJJ in 2016 because this is the one and only time that voters in the city of LA approved a ballot measure to increase density in the city. The one and only time. And that comes after, as you can see on here, and we'll see in a few subsequent slides, decades and decades and decades of downzoning our city and our region. In 2016, voters approved Measure JJJ, which has allowed for increased density around transit so long as developers are providing affordable housing as part of their projects. But it is the one and only time that voters have approved an increase in density in the city of LA. So just going to put that out there and for you to think about as we go through this. I'm going to be moving on to next slide here, but I do see that there was a raised hand. Esteban, do you want to open that up?
Yes, hi.
Got a little bit of an echo there.
Yeah, sorry about that echo. Got a raised hand from Carl.
Huh?
So, Carl, are you able to unmute yourself? Let's see. Carl? I don't know if he's able to unmute himself.
Okay.
Okay. Carl, are you there? Okay. I'm not getting any. No, and he's brought his hand down. Okay.
Okay.
I'll reach out, Carl. I'll reach out to you. But Luke, if you want to keep going, and I'll reach out to Carl and bring his
Absolutely.
question up in a bit.
Absolutely. All right. So this is a lot. I recognize this timeline is a lot to sort of absorb, especially if you're like, I'm just going to learn a little bit about housing. And then I go, look at this timeline of the last 100 years. But the key takeaway in this is to recognize how the thread that sort of ties these things together over time is civil rights, is white households, white political leadership, developing rules and guidelines that continually advantage them over black and brown households for years and years and years and years. And while technically that's no longer legal, if you look at the disparities, for instance, in wealth between white households and black households, the disparities in home ownership, which we'll talk a little bit about a little later, the effects of laws that existed for several generations up until the 1960s legally is still very much the way things operate today, and very much, from my perspective, important to understanding why housing policy is what it is today, why we see disparate outcomes today, because we did things a certain way for such a long period of time that were so disproportionately unfair to certain people, and that has then resulted in those challenges continuing to perpetuate. So let's dive in. So this chart just shows you for a 20-year span the living units or homes that were constructed in the city of LA from 1921 to 1942. And I want to note this for a couple of reasons. I've got the bullets there, but our most prolific decade for new housing construction in LA was the 1920s. It's not the last 10 years. It wasn't any decade in the last 60 years. It was the 1920s, 100 years ago. That's when we built the most housing in a single decade. You can see that the tallest bar there in 1923, when we built almost 44,000 new homes. That compares with right now, this past decade, we're averaging around 10,000 new homes a year, a quarter of that. So I offer this, in part just to sort of say, well, we hear a lot about there's so much new housing going up, but actually in reality, we built a lot more housing many, many years ago. I also offer here on this chart, there's a red bar underneath the 36 and onward. That is to note that that's when redlining was now. And you'll note that even though we see an increase in new housing construction in the 30s, and now it's more single-family housing than multifamily and duplexes, as compared or contrasted with what we saw in the 1920s, where yes, there was more single-family, but there was also a lot more multi-residential housing as well. So in those 1920s, when we were seeing all of that new housing construction, these are a couple brochures from the time. We're all familiar with the Hollywood sign, which was an advertisement for Hollywood land. And this is a brochure for Hollywood land, which you'll note talks about the despoilment, the residential districts of Los Angeles despoiled by metropolitan development, and talks about secure that the hills of Hollywood land are secured by fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism. Restrictions is a common word to hear at this time, and fixed restrictions are specifically referring to deed restrictions, so that these are homes that are not available to non-white households. And while they're sort of cute about that in the Hollywood land brochure, they're a little more Eagle Rock brochure, where you'll see on the second to the last line that they note that the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race, exclamation point. Family communities in the 1920s. And these are just a couple of the brochures. Every community, people were, developers were trying to get people to come move out to this or that community, and they recognized that deed restrictions limiting them to white households was an important part of what they felt like was an important part of how to sell their communities to people looking to purchase a home. So this was perfectly legal in the 19-teens, 1920s, until a Supreme Court case in 1948, which said the deed restrictions were no longer enforceable by a court of law, but they still existed. And then we get to redlining. So this is the map that was created for Central and West LA by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1936, which you'll see has 4 colors that are indicated for different areas. There's green, there's blue, there's yellow, and there's red. And the red areas are what the term redlining refers to. If you were looking to purchase a home in an area that was marked red on this map, you could not get a federally backed mortgage. It was not possible. If you were looking to purchase a home in an area marked yellow, it was possible, but it'd be very, very difficult. Really, the only areas that were really eligible to get federally backed mortgages were those that were colored green and blue. And also worth noting that some of these areas color-coded green on this map only had a few homes in them at the time. They were areas that they knew in 1936 there was going to be development because it was being subdivided by cities, but there wasn't a ton of homes in them yet at that time. A few things I also want to note on this. There's some areas that just don't have any color. A lot of the hills, downtown LA, really that's areas where there wasn't housing, period, end of story. So downtown LA, it's the financial district, so they didn't expect, there wasn't any sort of question for them about whether there was housing there or not. Southeast LA, you see a lot of not colored area. That is because it was mostly industrial. Same going southwest toward Culver City. There's a lot of oil rigs around there, so there's not a lot of housing in there. And then Playa del Rey and Vista del Rey, it was mostly natural wildland area. It wasn't housing at that time. So the map was really areas where in 1936 housing either existed or was scheduled or planned to be constructed, and color coded based on levels of perceived risk. So what do the documents say about that? Because these documents are actually available. You can Google Los Angeles redlining map and you can find the documents that were attached to each one of these areas color coded on this map. So let's just look at a couple of them. I've circled here this one area in green, which is directly adjacent to Runyon Canyon, and this area in red, which is kind of at the intersection of Virgil, Beverly, in Westlake MacArthur Park, so northwest Lake MacArthur Park area. And I'm just going to show you what the top of each of those documents said to sort of give the general contours of why they were color-coded in that fashion. So that area outlined in green was described in this fashion, that it had an moderately increasing population with business and professional men, executive capitalists, motion picture stars, with annual incomes of $3,600 and upward. They note that there are no foreign families, no nationalities, no Negroes, and no apparent or anticipated shifting or infiltration. You might think, well, what the heck is shifting or infiltration? Well, that area that was circled in red gives us a clearer idea of what they meant by that, where they describe the population as only slowly increasing with skilled artisans, laborers, white-collar, and Works Progress Administration workers, which was a federal program, part of the New Deal, with annual incomes of $700 to $2,000 a year. 20% foreign families, with nationalities being Japanese and Russians, and they indicate some Mexicans. They also stated that the Negro share population was 10%, and that they indicated shifting or infiltration of Japs and Negroes rapidly. This is official documentation that because of these descriptions, the federal government would not back mortgages in that community by law for 32 years. You could not purchase a home in this community that's outlined in red because it had a higher share of foreign families, it had nationalities of people from outside the country, it had a 10% share of Black households, and that there was what the official government documents indicated shifting or infiltration of people who were of Japanese descent and Black households in what they described as a rapid fashion. So a couple of things I just want to note, because these documents, you read them today and it's almost shocking that this was officially how we determined where people could, who could be eligible for mortgages and who could not. So another area I found, I've been going through these maps. So one of the areas, I mean, this is in descriptions of all of them. One of them, there was a green that was considered a very high green, like, yes, you absolutely should provide federal-backed mortgages in this area. They described as having racial protection in perpetuity, which is intended to mean that the existing deed restrictions will be successful in the minds of the folks who put together these maps in keeping anyone who's not a white household out of this community in perpetuity. Compare that with an area that was marked as yellow, where they said, they described the deed restrictions as leaving much to be desired, but they then said, but do protect against racial hazards. So the language here around non-white households is that they're hazards, or they're shifting or infiltrating. These were the documents used to determine where the federal government would back 30-year mortgages throughout the LA region. And these were maps used all over the country, not just here in LA. And these were the official law of the land until the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, after which point, sure, if you were a non-white household, you could be eligible for a federally backed mortgage. But now you've had these communities where only white households have been able to purchase homes for over a generation, up to 2 generations, in case of deed restrictions, maybe more than that even. And their household wealth and incomes have gone up while you've not had access to that in your previous generations, and your household have not had access or ability to access those resources. What's the ability or likelihood that you have to get on solid or even footing? So, I just note that while we technically made it illegal to use these maps in 1968, the pervasive effects of them has existed for a significantly extended period of time. One other thing that was really important to understand that sort of came about in the late 50s was what I call here incorporation. So a number of, many of us have heard the term white flight. And what we actually saw in LA County, LA County has 88 cities, over 30 of them incorporated in just a couple years span in the mid-1950s, when we suddenly saw this explosion of single family communities in areas that had been just, greenfield areas that weren't even on the redlining maps. But turned into these communities where it was all about local control. They wanted to have local control. They didn't want to be a part of the big city where there was other folks who had a voice in the process. They really wanted to exert their local control over much smaller pieces of the pie, but that were all deemed single family, that were all still restricted to white households. And we see a lot of these communities today that actually have subsequently, they're much more racially mixed, much more diverse in many cases, but not all of them. And I note here Lakewood. Lakewood was actually a city that set the table for a bunch of other cities to do the same thing, because Lakewood was was sort of the example here in LA County of a city that incorporated but didn't create all of its own departments, didn't create its own police department, own fire department. They contracted that out, which was not something that cities did at the time. It wasn't something they were able to do. Lakewood was taken to court over it, and they won. And then suddenly all these other cities popped up taking on the same approach. But I tie into this story because I think it's important for us to recognize what was going on at the time. It was still the era of redlining, but it was just a few years removed from the Supreme Court saying you can no longer legally enforce deed restrictions through the courts. And suddenly we see all these cities getting incorporated with local control being one of the key parameters, and white flight happening en masse at that time. Another thing that we saw a lot of at this time was what I'm describing here as downzoning. And hold on just a second. I want to make sure I'm, yes, okay. This is an example of a building in LA, which is not remarkable in any way, shape, or form. But we see, if you know, if you live in any of LA's older communities, you've probably seen lots of buildings that look like this. They're usually 2 or 3 stories tall, they're on stilts where you can park underneath, and then you have the apartments up above. They're almost always rentals. Very rarely are they condominiums. And these are actually a prototypical archetype of housing in LA, known as the dingbat. But I want to talk about one thing that we did here in LA that made dingbats extinct. So dingbats were very, very popular starting in the late 50s, the same time that we were seeing mass incorporation of new cities and white flight happening. These suddenly became very popular, and people trying to sort of, who were owners of parcels of land large enough to accommodate a 5, 6, 7, 8 unit building, and these were relatively affordable to build. Wood frame construction didn't require big cranes or concrete or any of that stuff. Well, some concrete on the ground level. So they were very, very popular starting in the mid to late 1950s, which is around the time we actually increased parking minimums in the city of LA to 1.25 spaces per unit. So architects who would design these would work backward. They actually still do this today for most new housing construction in our region, where they would determine how much parking the piece of land could hold, and then determine based on that how many units of housing they could build. But in 1964, we increased our parking minimums to 1.5 spaces a unit. And that ended the construction of dingbats, because suddenly it no longer penciled with the amount of parking spaces you could build on pieces of land, the amount of apartments you could build in conjunction with that. This is just one example of how we started employing downzoning, restrictions on heights, additional yard space you had to provide, setbacks, stepbacks, and I'll talk a little bit later about sort of the overall set of these things. But this is important in another way as well. So increased our parking minimums in 1958. At the same time, we were seeing mass incorporation of new single-family zoning all across the county. And in 1964, we further increased the parking minimums in a way that made these buildings no longer something you could build. Well, 1964 is an important year for us to understand what was going on. Sorry, I'm like looking kind of a little lost in my slides here. It's an important year for us, and I'll tell you in a little bit why that's an important year. We're not going to go quite into that. But at the same time we were doing this, we're also building our freeways. So 1956, federal government says, we're going to back all the local funding you put into freeways 9-1. And here in LA, we said, yes, we're going to build freeways. We're going to build freeways all over. But for many of us, when you drive on the freeway today, it's hard to know or remember that these are actually communities. The freeways weren't just like built on virgin soil. They involved mass demolition of whole communities. They involved cutting through existing neighborhoods up and down the city. And this is just a couple examples. The picture on the left showing the I-10 under construction just west of downtown. If you've ever come in from Santa Monica on the I-10 freeway, that's the interchange with the I-110 right by the convention center. And on the right, you can see the I-110 under construction downtown just to the right of it. And on the left is Westlake MacArthur Park. And that is, a familiar area for many of us. If you've ever walked across that trench on one of those bridges, which feel terrifying to walk across. But yeah, that is the freeway under construction, involving the tearing out, demolition of homes throughout the city. So this is what we built freeways all over. And I mentioned 1964 as an important year, because 1964 was the year that the state of California voters, we didn't just increase parking minimums on dingbats and make dingbats impossible to build. The voters of the state of California approved Proposition 14. Proposition 14 was in response to the Rumford Act of 1963, which the 1963 Rumford Act said you could no longer legally discriminate on the basis of race in buildings that were 5 units or more. So this was a measure before the Fair Housing Act of the federal government in 1968 that we passed here at the state level, that originally was to apply to all housing, but due to objections from a number of legislators, was restricted only to applying to housing of 5 units or more. So only in buildings of 5 units or more, you could no longer legally discriminate on the basis of race in California. Well, 1 year later, in the city of LA, we made it impossible to build buildings of 5 units or more. We made dingbats illegal to build, or impossible to build, by increasing parking minimums, which I would offer is not coincidental that the parking minimum increase had that effect. And we approved Proposition 14 throughout the state of California on a 2-to-1 basis, 65-35 to measure 1, which rendered illegal the Rumford Act. And it was approved largely on account of our right to liberties and local control, and that we shouldn't have the state telling us who we can and cannot provide housing to. That we should be able to decide here in California, even if it's on the basis of race. And in the county of in LA County, we approved of Proposition 14, 70 to 30%. So this was a very popular measure to put back in place legal discrimination on the basis of race. Governor Pat Brown at the time, to his credit, fought Proposition 14 in the courts, and in 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled Proposition 14 illegal, and on the basis that it was discriminating on the basis of race, and Proposition 14 was no longer the law of the land. However, Pat Brown, because he'd been fighting what was a very popular measure in the state of California, lost his re-election campaign in 1966 to Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan was now governor in 1967 when the U.S. Supreme Court said, you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race in the state of California with this Proposition 14, that the Rumford Act should be allowed to go ahead as law. And that ruling was shared in this headline that by the Los Angeles Sentinel, our oldest operating Black-specific newspaper in LA that's been around since 1933, showing a couple homes here, saying these homes are no longer out of bounds. Now, I just want to say a quick word about these homes. These homes are homes in Sugar Hill, which is a community in West Adams, near Western and West Adams, which was a very popular Black community in the 40s and 50s. It had deed restrictions, but as a number of these were very large homes, and as a number of these wealthy white homeowners were trying to go further west into Beverly Hills and Bel Air and wherever there were bigger homes and more expensive homes, they were struggling to find people to sell them to, and it just so happened there were some folks with significant wealth who were Black actors in the entertainment industry, performers who said, "Hey, we're willing to buy," and it changed this particular community. This particular community of Sugar Hill got a reputation for a couple of decades as being sort of the heart of Black Los Angeles before there was some dispersion into other communities. Even though most of Black LA at the time was along Central Avenue, south of downtown or South Central, this became sort of the wealthy entertainment community of Black LA. Sugar Hill is important though, and I noted the freeways before, because here's what Sugar Hill looks like today. Because what we did is we built a 12-lane freeway right through the center of Sugar Hill. And this is not coincidental. This is by design. Because even after some folks who were Black were able to get the resources to purchase homes in a community where they could take some pride in these beautiful, lovely mansions that they had, even after all of the discrimination they faced for years and years and years, we ended up just tearing out a bunch of those homes and building a massive freeway right through the heart of their community. We'll see in a little bit just how precisely our freeway network went directly through Black and has gone directly through Black communities in LA. This is another one I just want to highlight. This is a community that no longer exists in LA. You would not recognize it, but you look at this now and you think, huh, look, it's moderate density, and it's a range of different types of housing, and you would not be wrong. This is what it looked like in the 60s, after the city of LA used the 1949 Federal Housing Act to wholesale clear-cut Bunker Hill. We didn't just tear out all the homes on Bunker Hill, we actually flattened the hill to build the LA Department of Water and Power, to build the Center Theater Group, to build what is now Walt Disney Concert Hall, the County Hall of Administration, all these buildings that look remarkably sort of a similar time and era of the 60s and 70s. That's because that's when we tore out an entire community that was redlined on that HOLC map as being far too racially diverse, having no deed restrictions, old homes, and subsequently we tore it out altogether. So I noted secession, and I think it's important just to recognize that this was it's a little bit of a quirk here in our Southern California region. Sorry, I'm just going to mute real quick while I think I can. Oh, I'm not going to be able to. I have to sneeze in a moment. Okay, maybe I don't. So sorry about that. But we had in LA County for about a decade, from the mid 70s to the mid 80s, several attempts by largely white communities to secede from the rest of the county. So that picture on the left is actually when there was an effort from the northern part of the county to secede from the rest of the county. But of course, in order to secede, you needed a majority of voters in the area that wanted to secede, as well as a majority of the voters in the entirety of the county for that secession to be made law. And that never occurred in any of these attempts. They never got the majority of the voters in the entirety of the county. And the picture on the right comes from the 2002 effort for the San Fernando Valley to secede from the city of Los Angeles, which lost by a 2/3 vote of city residents. And those are some folks there campaigning against that effort to secede. But once again, we have mostly white wealthy homeowners attempting to secede on account of not wanting their taxes to go to other places and feeling like their dollars are being made available to other folks. Now, I recognize that for many of us, these may be things that we hear about and we don't necessarily see as intrinsically tied into sort of racist ideas and racist policies, but when they are continuing to persist a systemic racism in our housing policy, then by their very nature, they are racist policies. That doesn't necessarily mean the individuals behind efforts to secede are themselves individually racist, but when they're seeking to keep in place policies that are racist policies, that systemic racism, then the work that they're involved with is perpetuating systemic racism. And I think it's just important to call that out. And secession is just sort of one piece of a bigger timeline around that. And looking through the last 60, 70 years, you can see here the net effect of policy changes that we've implemented specifically here in the city of LA. And I noted earlier about the downzoning effect of parking minimum increases. And I mentioned a few other things. Those are all policies that we had sort of created and then made stricter and stricter and stricter from the 60s onward, reducing how tall you could build housing, limiting the amount of units you could put on a piece of land, increasing yard. So you have to have a bigger yard, you have to have bigger side yards, bigger backyards. You have to set the building back further from the property line, et cetera, et cetera. All of these, the net effect of all of these policies is that the city of LA 60 years ago had zoned capacity. We could have allowed up to 10 million residents in the city of LA. If you built out all of our pieces of land to their max capacity, but all of these policies getting implemented over a 30-year span, that zone capacity was reduced to just under 4 million. And there's been some slight uptick through some community zoning changes, community plan changes over the last several decades, with the most significant change, the one and only time that the voters of LA have approved increasing density in our city limits with Measure JJJ in 2016, which is not shown here on this chart. but has provided for increased density. And now the city of LA is actually, through the regional housing needs assessment, having to figure out how to accommodate more housing. And we'll get to that a little later. Something else I want to note under this idea of constriction. So we constricted through all those policies. Here's what the net effect of that was in housing that we've seen built in two different eras. The building on the right, these are two buildings on the same size parcels in Silver Lake. Building on the right was built almost 100 years ago with 28 studio and 1-bedroom split units and no parking spaces, and it's 3 stories tall. The building on the left, built about a decade ago, has 11 units with 20 parking spaces and 4 stories tall. So the building on the left has only about a third of the number of units, although it's got there are more bedrooms. Overall, it's fewer bedrooms than the building on the right. And when we talked earlier, and I mentioned earlier about the question about neighborhood character, I would guess that many of us, if we were to look at these two buildings, would look at the building on the right and say, well, that's more of the neighborhood character, but that's actually no longer legal to build. We can no longer legally build that building on the right because there's no parking. You would have to build a bunch of parking, but if you're going to build all that parking, the only way you can afford to build anything with that is to do what they did on the left, which is to go up another floor and build something that, for many of us, we would think is out of character, the neighborhood. But that's also the only thing that was legally allowed to be built on that piece of land. So further on this idea of constriction is noting that we used to build more mid-size housing, more of those 2, 4, 6, 10 unit buildings, but now it's almost impossible. So what we're seeing over time is a shift more and more to very, very large projects and single family homes. And that's it, and nothing in between, right? So these 50 unit or more buildings and single family homes and not a lot in the middle. And you can see that on this chart here, which shows that across LA, of all of our housing units, every housing unit all across LA, 10% of them are in buildings with 50 or more units, 8% are in buildings with 2 to 4 units. So relatively mixed. But if you look at it, of all the housing, if you look at of all housing, oh, sorry, I have to think about this chart, and I should not have to think about this chart. So the share of 2 to 4 unit buildings, of all of our 2 to 4 unit buildings in LA, the share of them that have been built since 2000, only 4% of them have been built since 2000. If you look at the share of all of our 50 or more unit buildings, 21% of them have been built since 2000. So that's to say that we're building a lot more relative to the overall share of our housing units, a lot more of those large buildings. And that just further is highlighted by this last point, that 43% of all the housing units we built in the last couple of decades have been in buildings that are 50 or more units. So we've really shifted across the LA region to building very large buildings on only a small amount of area and not much else. And that's also why that much earlier slide where I pointed out that we're only averaging about 10,000 new units a year, even though back in the 20s, 100 years ago, we were averaging somewhere between 30 and 40,000 units a year. That's because we've really sort of pared down where we can allow new housing to get built. And it's mostly getting built in very, very limited land area with very large buildings on that area. And case in point, downtown LA. Downtown LA is only 1% of our city's land area, but has accounted for approximately 20% of all new homes we built in the last 2 decades, which is a trend that's increasing. It's actually getting higher in its overall share, to the point where in 2018, half of the new units we built were in downtown LA. So there's been a lot of focus on downtown LA because it is seeing so much of the new construction we're allowing to get built in the city of LA. But that's also because we're allowing so little to get built anywhere else, because it's so difficult to build housing anywhere else. The same article that noted the 2018 statistic about downtown accounting for half of all the new homes built in 2018 noted that rents in downtown LA increased in 2018 1%, while the rest of the city averaged about an 8% rent increase. They were tying these things together, saying that actually all of that new housing going into downtown is keeping rents from going up as quickly as they're going up elsewhere, which, you know, I would tend to think is probably true, but obviously there are some questions about how exactly that works. So all of these things in our history are right up to the present day. What's the impact today? And maybe all we need is a little paint to turn our past housing policies into something entirely different. I would offer that that's probably not going to be that easy to do. And frankly, a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of the impact of our housing policies is very much the result of decisions we've made systemically over the last century. Essentially, our housing policy of the past is our zombies today. They're not easy to get rid of, and they're still hanging around with us. So to look into how much new housing we've been building, if you look at all of the existing housing in the city of LA, and this was done in 2016, so I apologize for it being a few years dated. If you look at all of the housing in the city of LA, only 13% has been built in the last 30 years. And in the last decade, we're seeing not a lot. Now, that number is probably up to a little over 50,000 through 2020, but it's still the lowest of any decade in the entire span of this chart. And also worth noting that over 2/3 of the housing in the city of LA was built when discrimination on the basis of race was perfectly legal. So yes, it is true that it has not been legal to discriminate on the basis of race for the past 50 years. But it is also true that over 2/3 of the existing housing was built when it was perfectly legal to discriminate on the basis of race. And a lot of that housing has remained through generations, handed down from one generation to the next, through generations that built up wealth, accumulated wealth, and then passed it down from one generation to the next. So a lot of the discrimination we see that's not explicit today as it was then is very much the result of policies that existed when most of the housing we have in our city was built. So I wanted to tie back as well in our history as present to redlining and to see how that has affected a number of things in our current day. This is, again, the redlining map. And now I want to show you a few different things related to that. First, this is our freeway network. And I mentioned earlier about the freeway going directly through Sugar Hill. That is right around here. West Adams Heights, or Sugar Hill. The freeway was routed directly through that. There were actually two proposals for the I-10 freeway, one which would have taken a little further south and run it directly through these redlined communities, and one that took it through the route it actually goes through and then brings it down onto the original line here through this redlined community. This was a source of significant discussion and consternation at the time, and they eventually chose not to go through Fraternity Sorority Row around USC, but instead to go through Sugar Hill. I would offer that it's important to think about this the next time you're driving on a freeway, and there's these little curves and twists and turns in the freeway. None of those are accidental. None of those are coincidental. The direction and routing of freeways was a very political conversation. Many of us are familiar with how Beverly Hills killed the 2 freeway, which would have run along Santa Monica Boulevard and then right through Beverly Hills. But not as many of us are familiar with the 710 freeway, which was constructed through Boyle Heights, but then stopped right before it went into communities that were yellow and blue on the redlining map. There are examples of this over and over where the freeway networks were specifically routed through communities that had been redlined and that the government had turned its back on in terms of its willingness to provide financial support for people to purchase and own homes in those communities for decades. I also just want to note something that I've heard is that it's important to know that you look at us and think, well, we built a lot of freeways. Well, we actually had plans to build a lot more freeways. We ended up only building about 60% of the planned freeway network throughout the LA County region. But there's a statement I've heard from a social justice advocate that I think is 100% right, which is we only built 60% of the freeway networks that were planned, but we built 100% of the freeways we planned to build in lower income communities. And that's exactly what we did. And you see that play out right here in Boyle Heights. And actually in Boyle Heights, we had a community that was quite diverse, that had folks from all different backgrounds, nationalities, ethnicities, races, and then we just totally destroyed it by building these freeways. There was one freeway that was directly routed right through a very well-known and popular church. And when we did this and displaced tens of thousands of people, it just so happens that the white households that were displaced could go ahead and purchase homes with federal backing in areas that were green or blue. But the black and brown households did not have that luxury. So not only could they not get federal backing, but they were stuck in communities that were now overrun with these massive freeways. So it's important to recognize the impact that those still have today on our air quality, access to resources, and on and on and on. Also, in terms of our history, where we have federally funded housing. So that one decade from 1940 to 1950, where we built federally constructed housing in the LA region and built 6,500 units, which are still around today and still providing housing for people with lower incomes. Those are all located, as you can see on this map, in areas that were either redlined or yellow. And that was by design. That is intent. That is where we built. We allowed to build this housing, and that's where it exists today. A few more things we're going to touch on here as far as the impact of redlining on people's access to opportunities and our impacts of housing policies today. One was a study that was done a couple years ago, which found that, looking across over 100 urban areas across the country, that redline communities were in some cases hotter by non-redline communities by 13 degrees. Now, I've looked at the data on this. The LA region, it was closer to 4 or 5 degrees. But think about just what we had this past week, where in downtown LA, we hit 97 degrees. Perhaps in our green line communities up in the hills of Beverly Hills or Bel Air or wherever, was only 93 or 94 degrees, where we also know they have many more trees. This is a significant impact for folks who are having to go wait for the bus, who are walking to the grocery store, who maybe don't have air conditioning. These have significant impacts, significant public health impacts, access to opportunities, access to resources. And this is still very much the case today. And the effect of redlining, as I'm calling this, history as present. We also have a disparate impacts of street safety, or what I call traffic violence, where a study here looked at, just a couple years ago, looked at what they described as high poverty neighborhoods born of decades of racial segregation, i.e. deed restrictions and redlining, that they found experienced disproportionate clusters of violence that concentrate fatalities among marginalized groups. So in other words, what they're saying is our black and brown communities are seeing significantly higher rates of traffic fatalities than our white communities. And we actually have just seen this over the last couple months with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we are seeing a significant reduction in collisions throughout the LA region, but we're actually seeing an increase in fatalities that is specifically happening in South LA, where people are driving faster, and there's people who are walking around who are getting hit by people who are driving faster because there's fewer cars on the road. And I want to say a little more about COVID-19. This is a couple maps here. One looking at overcrowding, where we have relatively more people living in homes with the same number of bedrooms as maybe homes elsewhere where there's fewer people living. So overcrowding is saying relative to the number of bedrooms, there's a higher number of people, a higher proportion of people in those communities. We're seeing significant overcrowding in LA, the LA region, for many, many years. But you can see that on this map, it's concentrated in the Westlake MacArthur Park area, East Hollywood, and South Central LA. But then you look at look at the maps around COVID-19 prevalence, and then also the city of LA has provided a map showing job losses since the COVID-19 pandemic began. And you'll see there is some connectivity. Now, I've not actually done a link map, link one-to-one on this, but the traditional sort of West LA versus Central LA, this plays out. And this is played out from the redlining maps of yore that still are very much determining things like where people are overcrowded, where COVID-19 is more prevalent, where job losses are more prevalent. So the communities that we disinvested in for generations are also the communities with seeing the most overcrowding, seeing the highest rates of COVID-19, and seeing the highest job losses during the pandemic. So it's just one thing compounded on another, compounded on another, compounded on another. And these were all policies that were based in racism. So this is all tied back to are the civil rights and housing being inextricably linked. So let's talk a little bit about density, about housing density, because this is something that many of us in the housing conversation, we think about things as density or not density. And so I want to just call out a couple locations here on the redlining map. I've circled them in the center of the map there for you, one in red, one in green. That's in the mid-Wilshire area. And the area outlined in green is actually indicated as blank. There's no color coding on there because it's the La Brea producing oil field. But the La Brea producing oil field is today the Park La Brea. And Park La Brea is housing, it is the most dense housing complex, the largest housing complex west of the Mississippi, provides housing for over 10,000 people, and it was constructed after World War II in order to provide housing for veterans. What's significant about that is that the federal government not only discriminated on the basis of race in redlining maps, but also did not provide housing loans to non-white veterans. Only white veterans were eligible for housing loans from the Veterans Administration. But most of these are rentals, so that doesn't necessarily apply for veterans who are returning from the war to live in Park La Brea. So Park La Brea is actually a fairly diverse community since its inception. Contrast that with Miracle Mile North, which is a housing community, or just a community directly across the street from Park La Brea, of only single-family homes. Park La Brea is over 6 times as dense as Miracle Mile North. And I offer this in part because when we think about density, we hear a lot of concerns about don't destroy our single-family neighborhoods, and it's going to be too much traffic and not enough parking and whatever else the concerns may be. But we have here the largest, most dense housing complex west of the Mississippi that is directly adjacent to some communities, not just Miracle Mile North, but a number of others that were green and blue on that redlining map. Single family, since they were created, exclusively available to white-only households for generations. And I would offer that actually the Park La Brea community is not negatively impacting any of those single-family communities today. If anything, it's providing housing opportunities for thousands of people who might otherwise not have the ability to live in this neighborhood that was exclusively cordoned off for white households for many generations. And so we look at it, just a couple more sort of the housing prototypes across the LA region. You'll see the map in the background here, the green, the pink and the blue. That is a map of the city of LA, of all the areas that are zoned for residential. The pink areas are zoned for single family only, and the blue areas are zoned for multifamily. You can build single family homes on multifamily, but you cannot build multifamily homes on single family. But I just note a couple of locations here in the San Fernando Valley in the upper right, in the hills above the San Fernando Valley in the upper left, that's the Encino Hills. These are communities that were exclusively for white households for decades. Lower right is Westlake MacArthur Park area, which was redlined by the federal government. And then the lower left is actually Condo Canyon, which is a very sort of unusual feature in the LA landscape, where we have all of these single family homes just to the north and south, which are multi-million-dollar homes. And then you have this one corridor along Wilshire Boulevard where we have allowed much taller buildings on individual parcels. And the only difference between the property holding a single family home directly adjacent to one of these buildings and the property holding one of these buildings is that the property with the large building allows 100, 150, 200, whatever the number may be, of households to all purchase a share of that property. And then the single family home property directly adjacent allows only one household to purchase that property, and no more than one. That is what single family zoning is today. If you want to be able to live here, you have to be able to buy the land and the building that you're going to live in its entirety, with whatever credit you have available to you. Otherwise, 75% of the residential zone land is off limits to you. So I want to say a quick word about CEQA. I noted that it was signed into law in 1970 by Governor Ronald Reagan. that is a bill that is still very much in effect, although there's been some very, very recent changes to it that will hopefully make some significant impacts in how it's been abused. But a study from a couple of years ago found that only 1 in 8 lawsuits under CEQA were filed by groups with prior records of environmental advocacy. That should give us a little pause that if a bill is intended to be protecting the environment but is overwhelmingly being used by individuals with no ties to environmental advocacy, that perhaps it's being abused. And in fact, 80% of CEQA lawsuits target infill housing. So the vast majority of lawsuits from a law that's being used largely by non-environmental interests are targeting housing getting built in cities, getting built in urban environments. And the biggest concern that I'm noting here around infill housing is traffic, which when I mentioned just a moment ago that there's been significant changes to CEQA. The bill the way that CEQA measures traffic is undergoing significant changes, which will then allow infill housing to be much easier to build without threat of lawsuit from CEQA, although that effort is now being derailed by a number of cities that still very much want to be able to use traffic as a way to stop new housing construction in their city limits. The last thing I just note that the California Legislative Analyst's Office looked at this, and that they found that any project that requires an EIR takes at least 2.5 years to approve. So an EIR puts in an environmental impact report under CEQA, has a significant impact on the construction of new housing in the state of California. I want to just quickly note this because this is a significant housing archetype in the state of California. Common interest developments, or gated communities, they actually spawned out of fights over in the city of Torrance back in the early 60s when the city was allowing for ongoing deed restrictions on the basis of race, even though the Supreme Court had ruled in the late 1940s that they could no longer be legally enforced. Torrance was refusing to budge, and they had riots in Torrance. And so then Torrance said, you know what, we're going to privatize our streets. And so you can no longer complain about us getting public funding for streets with housing on it that you no longer have the ability to access. It's now all private. It's no longer under the purview of the city and on along city streets. This became a very popular model. Common interest developments now account for housing for 1/4 of California residents. 1/4 of California residents live in gated communities. And now I know that's not necessarily as significant in the city of LA proper, but it is very common to find this across the region. And one of the things about common interest developments is while they are not necessarily racially segregated by intent, by design they often are. You'll often find that because they're a certain type, there'll be a certain housing type that you'll see times 100 or times 200 or whatever the case may be, that is governed by, in many cases, an unelected board who gets to decide in fairly racially segregated environments that aren't necessarily a racially segregated environment. So these are quite common in Orange County, San Diego County, a lot of different parts of cities attempting to continue to segregate housing even long after it was legally permissible. So where are we today in terms of access to housing on the basis of race? The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was created just a few years ago in the Obama administration, looked at this question and found that Black applicants for a conventional home loan, i.e. a federally backed mortgage, were still denied that more than twice the times as often as white applicants. Now these are, when they do these studies, they hold everything else constant. So the only variable is the race of the applicant. And still, to this day, if you are a Black applicant, you are more than twice as likely to be denied a conventional home loan. Same thing with home refinancing, which is a very important tool for people to be able to continue to afford to stay in a home, to be able to refinance when there's lower interest rates or whatever. And then again, Black applicants denied almost twice as often as white applicants. The only difference being the race of the applicant. So here we are. You might think, well, all those policies were from before 1968, but here we are 50 years later, and it's still very much at play or in play. I mentioned the subprime mortgage debacle from the early aughts, and in 2015, subsequent to the housing market crash of 2008, almost 30% of Black, and what they put here in this article, Hispanic borrowers' homes had gone into foreclosure since the housing market crash, compared with 11% of whites' homes. So we're seeing time and time again that the story of housing is a story of systemic racism, and this was baked in explicitly for generations. And subsequent to that, all we did was say, okay, no more racism, no more explicitly racist policies. But in fact, all we've done is perpetuate them through a number of other tools and mechanisms. And the result of that is Black home ownership today is about what it was back when the Fair Housing Act was written into law in 1968. And the gap between Black and white home ownership today is larger than it's been any time in the last 30 years. It's not just Black and white, though. We also see discrimination in any number of other ways, and I'm just calling out some headlines from the last couple of years where we're seeing housing discrimination for tenants, for people purchasing homes here across the LA region. This is still going on. This is still happening. This is still the story of housing policy, and why I want to, in this Housing 101, really talk about this, looking at the why of what housing policies are about, and not just the what of the strict machinations of them. And briefly talking about homelessness, which is another reason many of us come to this conversation. We just found out this week, actually just yesterday, that the most recent homeless count, which was done in January of this year, found an increase year over year from 2019 of 13% of the number of people experiencing homelessness in LA County, which was up 12% from the prior year. And the article noted that they expect that since the pandemic has been ongoing, that they expect the number of homeless to be even higher as a result of that, which I would just note is interesting, because it is particularly interesting to me as from an academic perspective, because we were seeing economic growth for the last few years, while at the same time homelessness was going up, and now we're seeing an economic collapse and we're seeing homelessness going up. I'm not sure when homelessness would go down, if it goes up both when we're doing well and when we're not doing well, but that is where we're at. I also note here that a lot of times we'll hear people complain that homeless folks are coming from elsewhere. And in fact, the vast majority of people who are experiencing homelessness in LA County were living here when they lost their home and have actually lived here for more than a decade. You also hear people say, well, it's substance abuse or mental health issues. There is a higher share of people who are experiencing homelessness who experience these issues than people who are housed, but it's not that much higher that it wouldn't be easily explained away by just virtue of having a house versus not having a house. This is not an issue of mental illness or substance abuse. This is about housing being unaffordable. And the best way to combat homelessness is providing homes. I also note here, because of the conversation around the impact of systemic racism in our housing policy, while Black individuals account for 8% of the county population, they account for 33% of our homeless. So once again, we're seeing decades upon decades of racist housing policies come into play and resulting in outcomes which were entirely the design of those outcomes. So I just note, to tie this up, building less housing than people demand drives high housing costs. That's the conclusion from the California Legislative Analyst's Office from a few years ago. And you'll see the bottom right chart shows how California home prices had generally been a little bit higher than US home prices for the middle part of the 20th century, but then suddenly decoupled in the 1980s and got much, much higher, just a few years after redlining was no longer legal, at the same time that we were implementing all kinds of restrictions on the construction of new housing, which was essentially that we first had walls built around our communities which were based on race, and then when that was no longer legal, we found a bunch of other ways to build walls that made it impossible for people who were from non-white households to purchase homes and be a part of the homeowner community, if you will, in the state of California, let alone to just be able to afford rent here in the state of California. And I want to leave off this conversation around history as present with noting this is Centennial. The Centennial, this is actually the Tejon Ranch. Just if you've ever driven on the I-5 between here and the Central Valley, the Tejon Ranch is a massive piece of land that is now going to be the site of Centennial Project, 60 miles north of downtown LA, 30 miles south of Bakersfield. It's going to have 19,000 new homes, just approved by the LA County Board of Supervisors last year for 19,000 new homes at a density of 1.5 homes per acre, which is much, much lower than most of the housing density throughout LA County, with 18% of those homes designated for low-income households. So hooray, we're building low-income housing in a high wildfire danger area. I just note this because at the same time that we're making it incredibly difficult to build new housing in the centers of our cities here in LA County, we're now about to see a massive area of 12,000 acres be completely built out with new homes, where the only way that most of these folks are going to be able to access their jobs is going to be to hop in their cars and drive 30 miles to Bakersfield or 60 miles to downtown LA. And this is what they're left with. This is the choice we've left ourselves with by making it so difficult to build new housing anywhere else in our cities. So here we are with suburbia, where they tear out the trees and then name their streets after them. That's what we've been doing. And it begs the question, all right, so who's in charge? Because if we can build 20,000 new homes out in the middle of a high wildfire danger area, but it's nearly impossible to build it in some of our cities, what's going on here? So let's talk a little bit about who's in charge here. Our county of LA has 10 million residents, which would make us the 8th largest state, larger even than Arizona or Nevada or Washington or Virginia. And that the 10 smallest states' populations combined are still fewer people than live here in LA County. And these are just some of the ways we subdivide LA County. In the upper right-hand corner, you see some of our 88 cities. I noted previously a number of those incorporated in the 50s when we were experiencing white flight and communities trying to create whole areas where it was just white households. That is actually a lot of the cities that you see on this map. And that each one of those 88 cities has their own city council, their own mayor, their own planning department, their own local planning process. In the center top, you see LA City Council, where we have 15 city council members, each one who has over 250,000 residents in their city council district, which are the largest city council districts anywhere in the country. New York City has over 50 council members. Chicago has over 50 council members. We have 15 in the second largest city in the country. Upper left-hand corners are congressional districts all over the place. Lower left-hand corners are 5 county supervisors. Each one has 2 million residents in their supervisorial district. And I noted the 88 cities in LA County. Those 88 cities account for 9 million of our residents. There are still 1 million residents in LA County who are in what we call unincorporated LA County. Their only elected official is one of those members of the Board of Supervisors, and that's it. So some of us have a city council member and a mayor. Some of us have multiple city council members because they're not by district. Our folks in unincorporated LA County have one supervisor who is accountable to 2 million residents. And on the lower right-hand side is our state Senate districts. All of these different maps overlap and hit each other in different ways. So there's no like consistency of governance, and very much that's by design. So we talk a little bit about here about our theory of change. I'm going to be very, very quick on this. And on the abundant housing LA theory of change, not an uncommon appearance in neighborhoods will be 2 signs next to each other, one like this, which is from Minneapolis, where they're saying everyone's welcome here. This was largely after 2016 in the election, people feeling sort of shocked by it and saying, oh, you know what, we welcome everyone, except don't change your neighborhood. You can be here, but you don't get to change your neighborhood. So what's our theory of change in abundant housing LA? 3 things. We want everyone to have a home they can afford. We want our communities to be livable, sustainable. We want to address the urgent climate crisis. Everyone having a home they can afford, the California Legislative Analyst's Office looked at this question, and they found that, very simply, building less housing than people demand makes housing more expensive. So all of those policies we enacted to cut down how much housing we could build had the desired effect, for some, of making the cost of housing go up. They did also find in this analysis that affordable housing programs are an important part of a broader set of policies to facilitate more housing construction. So housing set-asides, providing incentives for building more housing if you provide a certain amount of affordable housing is an important part of addressing our housing crisis. And overall, they found that policies need to be changed to allow more private housing construction in our coastal urban areas. Then about on this question of communities that are more livable and sustainable, just want to note this is a study from a couple years ago that looks at the costs to a city for a household in an urban environment and a suburban environment. And in every single case, the cost to the city for a household in a suburban environment is more expensive than in an urban environment. And this is what's happening across all of our cities that are strained to the hilt. And we're also now having this conversation about how much of the money that they do have goes to police, which is a significant portion of their budgets. And overall, their overall costs, I mean, you look at the policing on this study, and this is in Canada from a few years ago, so it doesn't reflect the kinds of numbers we're seeing in the US, are lower than a suburban environment, largely because there's fewer vehicles, there's fewer there's less infrastructure. But all of these things here that we're seeing here, water, wastewater, sidewalks, roads, libraries, governance, they're more expensive in an environment where homes are further spread apart than an environment where homes are more closely aligned. And then as far as the urgent climate crisis, it's important to note here just a couple things. One, from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, where they found that sprawl increases the amount of land consumption by up to 80% per person, and car use by up to 60%, which costs us in this country $1 trillion a year across the country. So there's a massive cost effect as a result of urban sprawl, which we see across our region. And then the International Panel on Climate Change from the United Nations in their 2018 report found that one of the more effective ways they could see to get a 40% reduction in energy use would be through what they describe as effective urban planning. What they mean in that terminology is let more people live in areas where they can do more of the things they need to do by walking or biking and taking transit. That's it. We need to be less auto-dependent. So what are some policy approaches we can employ here? At the end of the day, we're offering, you can't have a housing crisis to build more houses, but what are some of the things that we encourage our cities in this region to be doing as part of Abundant Housing LA? First, make more room for homes. We are concerned that a lot of the housing that's getting built today is constricted to smaller and smaller areas of our city, and largely areas that already have some of our more naturally affordable multifamily residential housing. So then we're building new housing by tearing down housing that is also relatively dense. We don't think that is necessarily the right approach. We want to see more room for more homes. We want to make it easier, cheaper, and faster to build homes. That CEQA abuse slide I noted, where CEQA, an environmental impact report, adding 2.5 years to the time it takes to build new housing. We need to be able to make it easier for new homes to get built so that it's not taking so long that it's adding an inordinate amount of cost to building new housing, which you and I all pay for whenever we try to buy new housing, rent new housing that becomes available. We need to raise money for more affordable homes. And key in all this, protecting tenants, because new housing should not come at the expense of folks who are already living here. And finally, we want to encourage innovation. We want cities to be willing and able to take new approaches they haven't yet considered. And through this conversation around this discussion around systemic racism, let's look at ways we can be intentionally anti-racist. We can intentionally target and undo decades and decades of policies which were intended to disadvantage non-white households to the advantage of white households, what are ways we can very specifically design systems to undo that and to give everyone an equal footing once and for all in this housing conversation? So I hope for all this, you're hoping to get involved. So here's some ways you can do that. You can join us and join everyone in LA, become a member. abundanthousingla.org/membership. You can donate. You can follow us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You can be a project volunteer. And I'll say a little bit about what that is in just a minute. And also attend hearings on housing projects. A lot of folks participated in that police commission online meeting, and there's a lot of meetings that are happening online right now that suddenly government is actually, for many of us, more accessible than it used to be, because it used to always be only in-person stuff at buildings that we couldn't get to in the middle of the day, that are now actually online, and you can call in and you can give comments. Participate in whatever way you can. Roderick Hall is our organizing director here for Abundant Housing LA. That's his email address. So if you have an interest in getting more involved, being a project volunteer, attending hearings, etc., let him know. One specific thing we're involved with is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RHNA, which is going on right now, where the Southern California region, 5-county region, adopted a plan which actually puts an emphasis for the creation of, or the allowance of, new housing construction more in our coastal areas than in our further flung rural and suburban areas. So cities like LA, Santa Monica, Burbank, Long Beach are going to have to be able to accommodate a lot more housing than they're used to. In the city of LA, they're going to have to be able to accommodate 500,000 new homes over the next 8 years. And that may sound like a lot, but you remember that chart where I showed you that in 1960, we had zone capacity for 10 million homes that we, over 30 years, brought down to 4. And we're talking about getting up to, well, nowadays we're probably at around 4.5-ish, so getting up to like 5. So about half of where we were 60 years ago. But that's going to be a big deal. It's going to be a big lift, because there's going to be a lot of opposition, because people are going to be concerned about, is this going to impact my views? Is this going to result in more traffic? Is it going to be a problem for parking? Whatever the case may be. So we encourage you to get involved. The cities are now updating their housing elements all across LA County and the region. And here for the city of LA, Abundant Housing LA has put out our Fair LA plan, which you can find on our website. Specifically around project volunteering, this is something where you can really sort of step up your involvement on specific projects that are coming up in your community. You can monitor City Planning Commission agendas for identifying projects that you think we should be supporting, writing letters of support, speaking in support of housing at the city. The time commitment here, we're asking 2 to 5 hours a week if this is something you'd like to do. And you can get more information by going to our website, abundanthousingla.org/take-action. So that's my presentation. I appreciate all of you hanging in there with us for this, and I'd like to open the floor for any questions that we may have from anyone at this point.
Yes. Hi, Luca Testeban again. Well, actually, first of all, as a resident of unincorporated LA County, thank you for mentioning that, for mentioning us. It's certainly a much different experience in terms of local governance. So Carl's question, Carl, who raised his hand earlier, he asks about JJJ and its overall effect on housing construction, given the incentives and the union labor. So if you could just talk about that. And then I have a question after this one as well.
Of course. So thank you for your question, Carl. So Measure JJJ had 2 significant components when it was approved by the voters in 2016. The first was that it encouraged, it directed the city to develop a strategy for allowing denser housing to be constructed around transit as an incentive in exchange for some portion of that housing, including affordable housing. And it also, the other piece of JJJ was that if a project was proposed in the city that required a zone change, like a general plan zone amendment, that then that project could only be constructed if it involved union labor. That piece of JJJ has very rarely been triggered subsequent to the measure's passage. There's only been a couple projects. So while before 2016, we would see a number of instances where a developer would want to build something that was not necessarily allowed by the zone, and they would require a general zone plan amendment. Those essentially stopped happening once JJJ passed. However, the transit-oriented communities portion of this, which is the city's implementation of the incentives for denser housing to be built along and around transit, has become very successful. And we've seen now, I want to say it's somewhere around in the neighborhood of 3,500 to 4,000 designated affordable units proposed for construction and or under construction since the passage of JJJ and the city's approval of its transit-oriented communities guidelines. And this has now become the most significant measure at any point in the city's history for the construction of new designated affordable housing as a result of Measure JJJ and the transit-oriented community guidelines that came about from it. I would just note that JJJ is City of LA specific. It does not apply to any other city in LA County. So to that point I made about the governance in all the other cities and unincorporated areas and all that, JJJ is just City of LA. It is not any other city.
Thanks, Luke. So we've got a couple more questions. The next one is...
And I'm going to close the slide here too.
Okay. The next one is, what should we do with wealthy, low-density areas of LA that are high fire hazards? Leave them single-family, do managed retreat, or allow multifamily construction?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. For my druthers, I would much prefer to focus on the wealthy, low-density areas that are not high wildfire, for where we would start to allow some moderate increases in density. So already, by state law, even though we have 75% of the city of LA is zoned as single-family only, state law already allows up to 3 units on all single-family parcels. And there's now a new effort to make that up to 4. So we've already done away, technically at the state level, we've already done away with single-family zoning, even though the changes are very, very slowly percolating through the city. But I think it's a little premature to be talking about with sort of withdrawal from fire zones, in part because that conveys that there is a government policy to eliminate or eradicate housing. And frankly, I think really from my druthers, our focus as people wanting to be active in this space really needs to be around where there's opportunities for coalition development and organizing around policies that are forward thinking and forward looking. And while yes, I do think at some point there will need to be some real acknowledgement of the dangers of existing housing in high wildfire areas, particularly for our region. Mostly we're talking in the state of California, most of the high wildfire housing, high wildfire danger or high wildfire prone housing is not in LA County. Certainly North LA County, that is the case. But in this LA city and our metropolitan region, it's not that much. I would much prefer, I think our energies are much better focused on things where we can be talking about more multifamily housing in our urban centers, and not as concerned with the handful of wealthy folks who want to live up on a hill where they're going to be dealing with high fire danger on a more frequent basis.
Thanks, Luke. And for anybody, so I've enabled the Q&A function. If it doesn't appear for you, feel free to shoot us a DM in Twitter or an email or something if you aren't able to either unmute yourself or ask a question in the Q&A function. Another question we've received is about the pandemic and what that means for housing, what it means for homelessness, and for urbanism and transit broadly.
It's a tough question. I've seen a lot of folks who have been who have taken the circumstances we're in right now and have extrapolated this to either mean that density is bad or density is good. And I don't think that that's the right question, because what we're seeing right now is that the pandemic is really bringing out right into the light just how much our systemic racism affects people's access to healthcare opportunities and affects their life circumstances. When we have a disease that ostensibly does not discriminate, right? We know that COVID-19 hits people the same way, regardless of the color of their skin or regardless of their ethnicity. But yet we're also seeing that overwhelmingly, very disproportionately, Black folks are the ones who are dying from this disease relative to their numbers in our, relative to the number of folks who are Black in our communities. That should tell us something. This is not about density. This is about decades upon decades of policies where we put freeways right through our Black communities, where we located our sewage treatment plants and our polluting factories directly adjacent to Black communities, and then made it impossible for people in Black communities to move out of them into communities where they weren't necessarily right alongside a freeway or weren't directly adjacent to a polluting industry. And there's this idea that where you live is very much determines the opportunities that you have available to you, as well as your life expectancy. And we're seeing that play out in this COVID pandemic. Where we go from here, I think that the only way that we learn something from this in a meaningful way as it relates to our housing conversation is when we recognize how much of our housing policies are a direct result of systemic racism and how much that predetermines who has the ability to survive this pandemic and who does not. Making this a conversation about density, to me, is a lose-lose conversation because it does not address the real issue at hand. And you could make an argument one way or the other about density, and we can talk until our heads are blue, and it's not going to change the fact that what's happening right now is the result of systemic racism playing out in the way this pandemic is affecting our communities.
Thanks, Luke. I know there's a raised hand from Derek. Derek, do you have the Q&A function on your Zoom available? I don't know if you do. But Luke, I'm sure you're happy to answer questions also that come up afterward. If people want to send us
100%.
My email address is Esteban, ESTEBAN @abundanthousinglA.org.
And just FYI, I can't see the Q&A function on my screen, and I'm one of the moderators. So if I'm not seeing it, I suspect others are not as well.
Yeah, that might be the issue. I enabled it after this started, so it may not be an option for some people.
And for those who are curious, part of the reason we've been a little more stringent is we've been Zoom bombed in the past. So we're trying to avoid that from happening again.
Yeah. But let's see. Okay, Derek, let's see. Derek, I'm gonna unmute you if you want to ask your question. Go ahead, Derek. You can unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Yes. Hi, Luke. This is Derek. Thanks for a great history of housing in LA. I had a question regarding the downzoning and building restrictions, such as increased parking requirements. And while they may have started in the late 60s, 70s as a proxy for redlining, as you presented it, but has the issue of neighborhood character and traffic congestion been the new argument for them that's taken the place of the original redlining argument? And is it a valid argument, do you think, given that we've kind of suburbanized our city fabric, and that's the new normal that people are used to, and they don't want to see it get changed and made into a more urban and congested environment? And so it's not redline and racist per se, but it is about quality of life.
Right. Thank you for your question, Derek. And I think we could do a whole we could do a whole presentation just on this question of neighborhood character. I asked the question around what neighborhood character means and how we define it, not because I have an answer, but because I think it's important when we hear people use that terminology to also hear what they mean by it. I've seen a number of projects that have been opposed in neighborhoods like Venice, like Sherman Oaks, on account of neighborhood character that were affordable housing projects. And it really should give us some pause to think about what it is that defines the character of our neighborhoods and what it is we're seeking to preserve. I don't want to speak to the validity of the comment or concern around neighborhood character. I do think it's important to recognize that we used to have zoned capacity for more than double the population in our city. And we know that our city's density is nowhere near that of a number of other cities here in North America, let alone around the world. So when we hear people say, we're full, we can't have more people, we're too congested, I think we should really consider what are they really saying? What are they concerned about here? Where is this coming from? We've all been conditioned by virtue of living in this city or this region for however long we've lived here to sort of assume certain things are normal or typical. And those things aren't necessarily normal or typical. They're just the way we've been conditioned. So mostly what I'm hoping people will sort of come away with when they think about those comments of neighborhood character or traffic congestion is, what does that mean and what are we really saying? And are those actually real things? Or are they proxies for other things? And I would just hope that, one thing I want to just sort of really note for folks here too is I keep referring to systemic racism because while I think, concerns around neighborhood character and traffic congestion may echo eras of old which were specifically around restrictions on the basis of race, most of the folks who raise those concerns now would not consider themselves personally to be racist. And just because the policies they're pursuing or promulgating continue to perpetuate systemic racism does not make them themselves intentionally racist. So I don't want any of us coming away from this saying, oh, that person's racist. But I do want us to recognize how these policies that we have today are reflections of very specific racist policies we had for decades that are still systemic racism at play. And that when we talk about things that seem very abstract, like setbacks in yards and height restrictions and density restrictions and floor area limits and or whatever, all these different things, that these are all policies that came about at a time that we were sort of grappling with. Suddenly everyone had access to housing and we couldn't restrict them anymore on the basis of race. And we found new tools in our toolkit and we've just made them more and more stringent since then.
Thanks, Luke. We've got two more questions. We've got Ian Lundy, who has raised his hand. So Ian, I'm going to unmute you.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Well, Luke, thank you so much for this. This was so comprehensive and impactful. I wanted to hear your thoughts on one of the things that can make density so powerful is when you can reduce the amount of trips necessary in a person's life, and specifically in a Californian context, making it so they have to get in their car less and less. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on ways that abundant housing can be advocating to reduce LA's history of segregating uses so explicitly, in order to make some of the infill development you're kind of advocating for more functional and make it easier to fit more people because they're needing to leave and get in their car less.
So thank you, and Ian, that's a great question. So there's a new type of housing that we're seeing more of in the last couple of years. It's not new, but we've made it legal again. Accessory dwelling units, where people can convert garages into housing, which is oftentimes naturally affordable. Something that they're talking about in another state, I think it was Oregon, are accessory commercial units, where you can convert a space that's up against, or you can create a space that's right up to the sidewalk into some small space commercial. So it could be a little coffee shop or a little corner store or something like that, which when we've got, these large areas in the LA region that are single family for blocks and blocks and blocks, and the only way that you can access, getting groceries or whatever the case may be is to get in your car and go somewhere. Accessory commercial units actually allow people to access some of those amenities more close by. So I do think it's important for us to look at not just how we do single family into multifamily in certain areas, but also how we enable and allow for some mix of commercial uses in our largely residential communities as well. Obviously, these things will have to go through all kinds of challenges and legal sort of battles along the way. But I do think there's a place for abundant housing in LA in that conversation. We're mostly focused on creating more housing for the sake of housing affordability and addressing our climate crisis. But you're absolutely right that it's not just about having more housing. It's also about having more things that people can access within the existing housing. And there's a place for that in the conversation.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Ian. And we've got a question emailed from Elaine. Elaine asks, we see an increasing dichotomy of housing supply. Either single-family homes and a medium-density housing development are the dominant types. What are ways to encourage, either through policy, design, or economic frameworks, etc., the supply of missing middle developments, reminiscent of projects like dingbats and bungalow courts, 6 to 10 units?
Thanks for your question, Elaine. And I think that's going to be our last question for the day. First, in terms of allowing missing middle, we have to get rid of our parking minimums or really reduce them, because as you saw in the case of dingbats, just a small uptick in the parking minimums completely obliterated any more dingbat construction throughout the city of LA. We don't really think about parking policy necessarily as impacting housing policy so directly, but it 100% does. I wrote my master's thesis actually on the impact of parking policy on housing affordability, and we could spend a whole other conversation about that. But parking policy is really critical to understanding housing policy, and parking way to artificial. So we have to really address that question head on. When you've got a piece of land and you're required to build X number of parking spaces in order to construct that housing, and it's particularly true for the 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 unit buildings, subterranean housing or whatever, like you see in these much larger developments where they dig a giant hole in the ground. Missing middle, you really have to just basically build it right on the ground. So parking is a key one. Another key one is setbacks. We actually have in LA City proper, we allow what they call small lot on land where you could build multiple residences, apartment buildings or whatever. You can build these small lot, which are individual homes that are right up against each other, where you buy that little bit of land that your house is on. And gone through its own downzoning since we implemented small lot a few years ago, where we increased the setback requirements so you couldn't build it. Why? Because people didn't like it being close to the sidewalk. But that functionally reduced the density allowance for small lot development because we increased the setback. Most cities, in an urban context, you're not required to have some big yard in front of your house, between your house and the sidewalk. But in LA, that's quite common because we require it by law, and that has a significant impact on the allowable density. So I think some little tweaks to like height restriction and setbacks are some of the key things for missing middle. That would be really important. Thank you for your question, Elaine. That's going to wrap it up. It's 2:00. I am really grateful to all of you for being here. I really appreciated the questions that y'all had. I hope that you have found this informative. We'll be doing this again probably in a month, although we don't have it on the calendar yet. But I think that, especially with the pandemic going on, it's a little bit easier to do this through Zoom. We're gonna bring it back. If you know any folks who you think would be interested, who you think would like to get more information about sort of the general sort of history around housing policy here in the LA region, please send them our way. I'm happy to talk to y'all individually as well. I put my email on the slide there. I'll bring it back up so you can send me a message if you'd like to. And thank you all just for being here. And have a great rest of your weekend.